My name is Anna Bennett, and I was 22 years old the night my father asked me to sign the papers that nearly destroyed my future. It was 11:42 p.m. when he slid the blue hospital folder across our kitchen table. My younger brother Ethan was upstairs connected to oxygen tubes after another emergency surgery, and my mother had cried so hard that the sleeves of her sweater were still wet with mascara stains. My father looked exhausted in the kind of way that makes you stop asking questions. He kept rubbing his hands together like he was trying to warm himself up from the inside. Then he looked at me and quietly said, "Real families sacrifice for each other." 5 years later, a federal bank investigator walked into Ethan's charity fundraiser carrying that same blue folder, and the sound of my mother's wine glass shattering across the ballroom floor was loud enough to silence 300 people at once. That was the moment my parents realized their secret had stopped being a private family burden and turned into felony fraud. And for the first time in my life, nobody in the room looked at me like I was the selfish daughter anymore. The strange thing about manipulation is that it rarely feels cruel in the beginning. If my father had screamed at me that night or demanded I sign the documents, maybe I would have noticed something was wrong sooner. But he didn't. He sounded defeated. Human. My brother had spent most of his teenage years in hospitals, and after a while our entire family started revolving around survival. Ethan wasn't arrogant or spoiled. He was sick. That made everything more complicated. Because when someone you love is suffering, guilt becomes easier to disguise as responsibility. My mother quit her job to take care of him full-time. My father refinanced the house twice. Every conversation eventually became about bills, treatments, insurance calls, or surgeries. Somewhere in the middle of all that chaos, I slowly became the child who needed the least attention. Nobody announced it out loud. It happened quietly over years, like furniture fading in sunlight until one day you suddenly notice the color is gone. By 16, I had already learned how to disappear politely. I stopped asking for new clothes because hospital bills matter more. I stopped talking about college because Ethan's treatments were more urgent. When my acceptance letter from Northwestern arrived, my mother cried harder than I did. For a few hours, I actually believed something good was finally happening for me. Then Ethan collapsed again 2 weeks later, and my acceptance letter disappeared into a kitchen drawer beside unpaid medical statements and insurance forms. 3 nights later, my father sat me down and explained that timing mattered in life. He said Ethan needed the money more than I needed a dorm room. Looking back now, I realize nobody even asked what I wanted. They simply assumed I would understand. And I did understand. That was the problem. I stayed home and enrolled in a local college instead. During the day, I attended classes. At night, I worked reception at a small dental office downtown. Every paycheck I earned disappeared into the same household that constantly reminded me how fragile Ethan's condition still was. The worst part is that Ethan himself always felt guilty about it. I remember finding him crying once after overhearing my parents arguing about treatment costs. He looked at me and whispered, "I ruin everything." I sat beside his bed for almost an hour convincing him he didn't. Because he didn't. None of what happened later was Ethan's fault. And maybe that's why the betrayal hurts so much. Because I truly loved him. The night my father handed me the blue hospital folder, he explained everything using complicated financial language that made me feel selfish for questioning him. Emergency authorization. Temporary processing. Insurance extensions. My mother stood quietly at the sink while crying into a dish towel, and every few minutes she'd whisper something like, "I don't know what we'd do without you, Anna." People think guilt is loud, but it's not. Real guilt sounds soft, exhausted, loving. That's what makes it dangerous. "Just sign where highlighted," my father said gently. "This buys us time." I should have read the documents carefully. I know that now. But when you spend years being trained to believe sacrifice equals love, obedience starts feeling morally correct. So I signed every highlighted page inside that blue folder. Then my father hugged me tightly enough to make me believe I'd finally done something important. For a while, life seemed normal again. Ethan slowly improved. My mother smiled more often. My father stopped looking permanently terrified every time the phone rang. I finished school and eventually found a full-time job as a financial compliance assistant at a consulting firm downtown. The irony of that still makes me laugh sometimes. My entire career became centered around identifying financial irregularities while my own life quietly sat on top of fraud I couldn't even see yet. At 26, I tried renting my first real apartment without roommates. I still remember the leasing manager's expression changing halfway through the application process. At first, she sounded cheerful, friendly. Then suddenly her tone became careful, formal. She excused herself from the desk for several minutes before returning with a printed copy of my credit report. I'd never seen numbers like that attached to my name before. Delinquent accounts, collection notices, massive outstanding medical debt connected to financing companies I didn't recognize. I actually thought there had been a mistake. I think someone mixed up my file, I told her. But nobody had mixed anything up. I walked back to my car feeling physically cold despite the July heat. My hands shook so badly, I dropped my keys twice before starting the engine. When I called my father, there was a long silence before he answered. And honestly, that silence told me everything before he even spoke. "Anna," he said quietly, "don't overreact. Innocent people don't prepare you for your reaction before explaining the truth." When I confronted my parents that night, my mother started crying almost immediately. My father paced around the kitchen, explaining insurance complications and emergency financing like he was giving a business presentation instead of admitting betrayal. "You said this was temporary," I whispered. "It was supposed to be." Supposed to be. I still think those 3 words permanently changed something inside me. For the first time in my life, I stopped automatically surrendering emotionally. I started asking real questions. Why were there multiple accounts under my name? Why had new authorizations appeared years after I signed the original documents? Why were collection agencies contacting me instead of them? My father's calmness slowly disappeared the more specific my questions became. My mother kept repeating the same sentence over and over. "We did what we had to do for Ethan." Not for survival. For Ethan. That distinction mattered more than they realized. Because suddenly I understood something terrifying. My future had been quietly traded away inside a system everyone expected me to tolerate because the reason sounded tragic enough. A week later, I scheduled a meeting with the bank connected to several of the accounts tied to my identity. That meeting changed everything. The investigator assigned to review my case was a woman named Denise Harper, mid-50s. Calm voice. Sharp eyes. The kind of person who notices details other people overlook. She spent nearly 40 minutes silently reviewing paperwork before sliding one document across the desk toward me. "Did you sign this authorization 3 years ago?" she asked. I stared at the signature. It looked like mine, but it wasn't. That was the exact moment my stomach dropped hard enough to make me dizzy. Because suddenly this wasn't emotional manipulation anymore. It was fraud. Denise's tone changed immediately after that. Softer somehow, but also colder in a professional way. She explained that multiple financing extensions had been approved under my identity long after the original agreement expired. Additional signatures existed. Digital authorizations had been submitted repeatedly. "Miss Bennett," she said carefully, "did you authorize anyone to continue signing financial documents on your behalf?" The hardest part about family betrayal is how desperately your brain tries protecting people even after the evidence becomes undeniable. I kept explaining context instead of facts. Ethan's illness, the stress, the pressure my parents were under. Denise listened patiently before finally interrupting me with a sentence I still think about all the time. "Trauma explains behavior," she said. "It does not legalize identity fraud." That was the first time anyone in authority had acknowledged my pain without immediately comparing it to Ethan's suffering. I cried in my car for almost an hour afterward. Not because of the money. Because I realized my silence had protected everyone except me. When I confronted my father again, he didn't deny the forged signatures. Somehow that would have hurt less. Instead, he justified them. "You had good credit," he said bluntly. "We were drowning." I remember staring at him across the dining room table feeling like I was looking at a stranger, wearing my father's face. My mother begged me not to involve outsiders. Ethan overheard the argument halfway through and walked into the room, looking terrified. "What's happening?" he asked quietly. Nobody answered immediately, because nobody had ever planned for Ethan to learn the truth. That was the night I discovered my brother genuinely believed our parents had handled the medical debt themselves. He had no idea my identity had been tied to everything for years. Watching his face collapse as reality hit him was one of the few moments in this story that still hurts too much to revisit completely. He kept apologizing over and over while my mother screamed that stress would make him sick again. Somehow, even then, the emotional focus returned to protecting everyone except me. Over the next several weeks, Denise's investigation expanded. More forged documents surfaced. More signatures failed verification. My father started calling me constantly, alternating between guilt and anger, depending on the day. Some mornings he sounded broken. Other days he accused me of betraying the family by speaking to investigators at all. "You're acting like we stole from you for fun," he snapped once.
No.
"You stole from me because you believed I would stay silent forever. That's worse." Around the same time, Ethan's Recovery Foundation announced its annual charity fundraiser downtown. It was supposed to celebrate his remission and raise money for pediatric treatment programs. My mother insisted I attend because family appearances matter. I almost laughed when she said it. Apparently, family appearances had mattered more than my future for years. I nearly refused to go, but part of me needed closure. I needed to see whether my parents actually understood what they'd done, or if they still believed tragedy erased responsibility. The ballroom looked beautiful that night. Crystal chandeliers reflected across polished marble floors while waiters carried silver trays through conversations about generosity and resilience. Donors shook my parents' hands while praising their strength. Watching strangers admire them felt surreal. My father wore the same navy suit he always used for important family events. My mother smiled constantly, though I noticed her eyes checking the ballroom entrance every few minutes like anxiety had settled permanently inside her body. Ethan looked genuinely happy for the first time in years. That complicated everything emotionally, because part of me still wanted to protect him from what was coming. Then Denise walked into the ballroom carrying the blue hospital folder. My mother recognized it instantly. The wine glass slipped from her hand before Denise even reached our table. The sound shattered across the marble floor so sharply the entire ballroom went silent. Nobody spoke. Denise approached calmly, professionally, like someone delivering facts instead of destroying a carefully constructed illusion. 2 additional investigators followed behind her. My father went pale so quickly it honestly frightened me for a second. "Mr. Bennett," Denise said evenly, "we need to discuss the fraudulent financial extensions connected to your daughter's identity." No screaming. No dramatic accusations. Just facts. And somehow that destroyed them more completely than rage ever could. Guests nearby started whispering immediately. Donors exchanged uncomfortable looks while my mother desperately tried explaining that everything was a misunderstanding. Denise calmly opened the folder and placed multiple forged signatures across the table one by one. I remember Ethan staring at the documents like he physically couldn't process what he was seeing. Then my father looked directly at me and said the sentence I think he genuinely believed would still work. "We did it for family." Something inside me finally went quiet after that. Not angry, not devastated, just finished. I looked at him for a long moment before answering softly. "No," I said. "You did it because you thought I'd never choose myself over your guilt." The room became so silent I could hear silverware clinking somewhere across the ballroom. My mother started crying again, but for the first time in my life, her tears didn't control the direction of the conversation. Denise continued explaining procedures while donors slowly stepped away from our table. I watched years of carefully protected family reputation collapse in less than 10 minutes. And honestly, I didn't feel victorious. I felt tired. Because public justice still can't return the years someone quietly stole from you. Ethan found me outside the ballroom nearly 20 minutes later. He looked devastated. Smaller somehow, like the truth had physically reduced him. "I didn't know," he kept saying. "I know," I told him. And I did know. That's why I could forgive him. Not completely, but enough. He cried harder than I'd ever seen before when he realized the treatments that saved his life had also destroyed mine financially. I think part of him understood that surviving at someone else's expense creates a kind of guilt medicine can't cure. My parents eventually faced charges. Reduced charges mostly, because Ethan's medical history complicated public sympathy around the case. But the investigation was real. The debt was restructured. My credit slowly recovered over time. It took years. I don't speak to my parents much anymore. People always expect some dramatic explanation when they hear that. But honestly, silence became easier than repeating the same pain forever. Sometimes distance is the only boundary toxic love understands. The hardest part about family betrayal is realizing the people who raised you sometimes depend on your silence to protect themselves. For years, I thought staying quiet made me a good daughter. I didn't realize it was making me invisible. And maybe that's the cruelest thing about emotional manipulation. Nobody forces you to disappear all at once. They simply reward your silence until you forget you were ever allowed to have boundaries in the first place. If stories about quiet revenge, emotional justice, and painful family truths speak to something personal in you, there are more stories waiting for you here on Her Silence. But honestly, I still wonder sometimes if I should have stayed silent that night. What would you have done?